Good evening, everyone. My name is Jan John. I'm the chairman of the Outreach Committee of the Lincoln County Democrats, and we welcome you back if you have been with us before for one of our community conversations with Professor Heather Cox Richardson. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we'll be talking about the filibuster, the history of the filibuster, and the implications for our current environment and perhaps the future of our democracy related to the filibuster. So before we get going, I just want to make sure that you all recall that Heather is the author of several books, and she has quite a national following on her Letters from an American newsletter. Many of you probably subscribe already. She's a seasonal resident of Maine, and we take special pride in thinking of her as a local. Upon the conclusion of Heather's remarks, we'll go through, as Autumn mentioned to you, the questions that have been submitted, and thank you to those who have submitted questions. And there will be an opportunity, since Heather has seen these questions, she's going to try to incorporate those questions into her discussion. But if she hasn't covered something that you specifically want to cover, if we have time, we'll try to go about and include those questions in to give Heather an opportunity to answer. We plan to end the session at about 7:30, but as Heather said, while she hasn't had dinner yet, and she still has a newsletter to write for tonight, if she's in an engaging conversation, she said that she would continue to join us. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to Heather Cox Richardson for our discussion on the filibuster tonight. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for taking time out of your evenings, especially on a night like tonight, to talk about the filibuster, which is not necessarily one of the most exciting things to be spending your evening doing. So we do have the chat open, and I have remarks, but I also would like to make this a conversation. So if there are things that you would like to, that seem appropriate for wherever I am, please feel free to throw them in. And we're a small enough group here that we can actually do that, which we can't always do on some of these big Zoom events. So Jan asked me to talk about the filibuster and the history of the filibuster, because it seems for a lot of people that it's fairly confusing. And I want to start by saying all the filibuster is a refusal to stop talking. And that has a history in our country, but it has a history in the Senate especially, because in fact, what happened was that if you think about it, in the early years of the Republic, there weren't that many people in either the House or the Senate. So they didn't really have to have rules to make people shut up. And that changes really quickly in the House of Representatives, because they start to get much bigger, much quicker. And so by 1811, by the time the House of Representatives is up to 141 people, they recognize that they have to have some way to limit debate. Otherwise, nothing ever got done. So the House by the 18 teens came up with a way to stop debate, to make people shut up so they could go ahead and vote and get on to the next thing. And this didn't happen in the Senate, because the Senate, of course, was much smaller. But by the 1830s, it was pretty clear that the Senate really needed something like that. And when it turned out, when they actually realized that they had to find a way to stop people from talking, they went back and took a look at the earlier regulations that were set up under the rules of the Senate. And they discovered that completely, not inadvertently, they knew they were doing it, but they never thought they would need it. They got rid of the same mechanism that the House could turn to in 1811. The Senate had gotten rid of that same mechanism in 1806. So that the Senate never got something that could make people shut up, basically. And again, it wasn't really an issue in the 19th century, the early 19th century, because it was a small group, and they tried as much as they could to compromise with each other and to agree to stop talking and get to a vote, to call it quits and to get to a vote. So one of the things about the mid-19th century and right up until the late 19th century and into the early 20th is that the filibuster is really not used. It's used very, very rarely, and often in highly partisan, somewhat symbolic ways. And so, so nobody really worries that much about the filibuster in the 19th century. The Senate simply operates the way it was supposed to under the Constitution, which is by majority rule. If you wanted to get through a bill in the Senate, it needed 51 votes, and well, not 51 votes. I'm sorry, it's a smaller Senate. It needed one vote more than the other side had, and it went through. And that's the way they did legislation through the early 19th century, through the Civil War, into the late 19th century. The Senate was simply a majority vote. All right, so what happens is that over time, the Senate, as I say, doesn't really use the filibuster very much. And it finally starts to use it in the late 19th and early 20th century on things like anti-lynching legislation. But it really becomes an issue in 1917, because in 1917, Woodrow Wilson wants to get through a law to let him go ahead and arm merchant vessels that are crossing the Atlantic in the face of unrestricted submarine warfare in World War I. When the Germans turned to unrestricted submarine warfare, the America as well as England tries to combat that by arming merchant vessels. And there's 12 senators who are fervently anti-war, and they filibuster that bill. And they say, there's just no way we're going to let this happen. And Wilson takes a look at this, and he's like, this is suicidal. We have to go ahead and find a way to stop people from being able to do this, simply talking a bill to death, because that's exactly what it used to be. You had to talk and talk and talk until people were finally like, okay, we're done. We're going to go on to the next matter of business. And so what they do in the around the time of the 1917 is they go ahead and they come up with a system to make people stop talking, and it's called cloture. And what that means is you need nowadays the numbers of how many people you need to have to achieve cloture has changed over the years. Now it's 60 votes, which is why nowadays people say you need 60 votes to break a filibuster. And all cloture does is it says, yeah, you guys have to stop talking in about 30 hours. It's not immediately, it takes a number of days. So we get that way to stop people from talking in the 19-teens. And then really the filibuster is not used again in any really significant way until civil rights legislation. And the filibuster begins to be used heavily by Southern Democrats primarily in the middle of the 20th century to try and get rid of the civil rights legislation that's being pushed at the time primarily, not entirely, but primarily by Republicans early on in the 50s. And then in the 1960s, you're going to get a whole mixture of political parties that I can tell you about if you want. But pretty famously, we get the filibuster of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by Southern Democrats, and then you're going to get a major filibuster by Strom Thurmond, which is one maybe many people remember in the 1950s, the 1950s and the 1960s of the Civil Rights Act, by people trying to guarantee that we're not going to get civil rights legislation. So you've got these talking filibusters in the 1960s, but there's a problem with the talking filibusters, aside from the obvious, and that's that there's a lot more business. After World War II, I kept saying that the filibuster wasn't used much. Well, Congress didn't do much until after World War II. And after World War II, when Congress starts to do a lot more, because first of all, the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then the civil rights legislation and the middle way by Eisenhower, mean that, and what happens after that, the liberal consensus that's embraced by both Democrats and Republicans, means that Congress does a lot more. And so you really can't afford to have people refusing to stop talking. You need to go ahead and move the business along. So there's a number of reforms that happen in the 1970s and going forward that change the nature of the filibuster. And they're pretty dramatic. So they're procedural innovations that do a number of things. So rather, for example, than having to talk your way through a filibuster, you can simply say you're going to talk your way through a filibuster. You don't have to do it. You can just say you're going to do it. And that will go ahead and stop a piece of legislation. So this is why you don't have people standing up in the middle of the Senate nowadays going ahead and talking to stop a filibuster. You also get what's called tracking, which means that rather than in the early filibusters, the Senate would have to basically stop business while the filibuster took place, so nothing else would get done. And the Senate came up with a system of tracking, which said that you could have more than one major bill at a time on the Senate floor. So you could go ahead and have somebody filibustering one piece of legislation while in a different time of day you were handling a different piece of legislation. So that enabled the Senate to speed up its business. It also realized that that there were certain things that they didn't want to waste time filibustering because it would enable a minority to go ahead and stop really important bills. So in 1973, the Congress goes ahead and, 1974, Congress goes ahead and says that there are going to be certain kinds of legislation that can't be filibustered. And those are going to be monetary things, and which is why you sometimes hear about legislation passing through budget reconciliation. By law, by this 74 law, there are 3 pieces of legislation that can go through a year under budget reconciliation. And it needs to, those pieces of legislation have to have certain characteristics of spending money that mean that they fall under that rubric, but those cannot be be filibustered. So anything having to do with financing the government, not anything, but under this umbrella, those things can go through without filibusters. All right, so what happens then is that the filibuster is not really dramatically used, as I say, until we get a real shift. And we get a real shift beginning with the election of Barack Obama to the presidency in 2008. And with that, you're going to see a really major shift in the way the filibuster is used. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a second. But I wanted to tell you the other exception to things that could be filibustered. What happened was that the Republicans during the Obama administration were refusing to let courts of appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit go through the Senate. They weren't letting the Democrats put people on the court because they were simply filibustering those decisions. So in 2013, Senate Democrats went ahead and used what was known at the time as the nuclear option to go ahead and eliminate the filibuster for lower court nominations. And what that, well, let me actually finish that. And that's 2013, but they kept it for Supreme Court nominations. You could still filibuster those. And then, of course, in 2015, when the Republicans took control of the Senate, they went ahead in 2017 and they got rid of the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, which is how we managed to get, for example, Neil Gorsuch, Amy Coney Barrett, and Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, because those Supreme Court nominations were no longer covered by the filibuster after 2017. So the exceptions to the filibuster rule are things having to do with the budget and things having to do with the nomination to the courts. All right, and that's really important. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the history of the filibuster, but that's really important right there, because what the filibuster has done in the modern era is the uses of the filibuster, as you know, went off the charts in 2008. That was a really big deal. They went off the charts in 2008. Because by 2008, what the Republican Party has begun to do is to use the filibuster to stop any Democratic legislation. And the reason for that is because if you look at what I just laid out to you, the fact that you don't have to filibuster judicial nominees or financial matters, what that means is that what the Republicans want, they can get on a simple majority because those things are no longer covered by the filibuster. That is judicial nominations and the funding of the government, especially the large military budgets in which they're primarily interested. So what that means is that the Republicans are perfectly happy with the filibuster the way it is, because they can then turn around and filibuster the legislation the Democrats want, because we're at this extreme point in American politics where the Republican Party really would like to stop the federal government from doing anything. That's the idea. They want to go back to a system from before the time of Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt, back to the time before the liberal consensus, and they're pretty open about that. Well, the Democrats, on the other hand, want to go ahead and use the federal government in certain ways. So really quite dramatically, for example, after the Sandy Hook shooting, the Democrats had a majority in the Senate, but they were 5 votes short of the 60 votes. And again, that's a really interesting one because that particular piece of legislation that they were trying to pass at the time was popular with about 90% of Americans. So there's a structural problem in the Senate as well, in that the fact that the Republican states have many fewer people in them than the Democratic states. So right now the Senate is split 50-50, but the Republicans represent 40.5 million fewer people than the 50 Democrats do. So the existence of the filibuster, the way it is, permits that minority to go ahead and stop the passage of really quite popular legislation. Not just obviously the gun control legislation, but some of the other stuff that's out there as well. Now, the real illustration of this, and the reason I added that in there, was because you may or may not remember that when Joe Biden got elected and the Democrats took the House and the Senate in the 2020 election, in 2021, we had a very hard time actually organizing Congress because Mitch McConnell refused to organize, refused to allow the organizing regulation, to adopt the organizing regulation for Congress, unless the Democrats promised not to touch the filibuster. And that was a huge bone of contention for a lot of people because it felt as if the minority, the Republican minority, was stopping the Democrats even from organizing the Senate, because they simply said, we won't do it unless you promise that you will keep the filibuster intact. And you may remember there was a lot of a negotiation around that. And finally, what happened was on January 25th, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky, gave up his opposition to the organizing resolution for Congress on the condition that he was guaranteed by Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a Democrat, and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, also a Democrat, that they would preserve the filibuster. And that's how we actually organized the Senate. Had that not happened, who knew where we were going to go with that? So the takeaway from all this with the filibuster is that the filibuster is not, I mean, it's a historical part of our system in the sense that it's kind of been around, but the use of it as a way to dramatically stop legislation is really very quite new. And it has done something really interesting to our passage of legislation, because in addition to the fact that it has essentially given a systematic leg up for the Republicans because they can get anything they want, and at the same time they can stop anything the Democrats want simply by the use of this old system, or the new use of an old piece of Senate legislation, if you will, Senate rules, if you will. It's also done something really interesting in the passage of laws, because rather than there being the weight on the minority to have to take a big stand to stop something, to talk all night, for example, or to try and change people's minds, the weight of trying to get legislation through falls on the people who want to pass it, who actually have a majority. So it's much harder for the majority to actually get legislation than it is for the minority to stop legislation. And that's a really big difference in a democracy, that rather than making it easy to get legislation, we make it easy to stop legislation, which again serves the purpose of going ahead and unraveling a lot of the liberal consensus legislation that's been in place since 1933. So that's the history of the filibuster. And again, what's obviously at stake here is the way a democracy operates. And the idea that that it's easier to stop things from happening than it is to get things to happen. And a couple more things to answer questions that people asked. There is an argument that the filibuster is unconstitutional, and that's the argument that is made about that is the fact that they go back to the Constitution, which simply calls for a simple majority for the Senate to pass legislation in the Constitution is a simple majority. So the idea that you suddenly have to have 60 votes to pass legislation is arguably unconstitutional. And so that's one of the questions that people asked, is why people say it's unconstitutional. And I forget the other one. I'll remember it when somebody asks it. So so the question is, the other question was, how, are there ways to reform rather than simply get rid of the filibuster? And yes, you can see conversations about this, including from people like Manchin of West Virginia, and that is simply a request to bring back the talking filibuster, so that people can't just say, oh yeah, I'll filibuster that. They actually have to put some skin in the game and go ahead and do it. And that would likely stop what seems to be an increasingly frivolous use of the filibuster. So so I'm going to stop there and let you ask questions. But if you don't have questions, the way this is playing out right now in Congress is actually really interesting, with the battle over the filibuster, over the Senate won for the People Act protecting voting, and over the House bill to create a bipartisan independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. So I can tell you about that if you'd like, but why don't I take a break here and you can tell me what you'd like to know that I didn't cover.
Thank you, Heather. We do have a couple of questions that have been submitted, but I'm going to take moderator priority here and ask you one of my own. You talked a little bit about, that was wonderful, everything that you presented us with. I'm feeling the need to sort of touch up on some of the things that you mentioned. One of the questions that someone had asked is, and you just responded to that, do we have to eliminate it altogether, or can we just modify it somewhat? How does that work? Does it require 51 votes to change the rules of the filibuster? Do you know the rules on that?
Yeah, no, the problem here all along, I always have to say this. The Senate rules are miserable. I mean, they're so hard to figure out. House rules are really quite simple and obvious. Senate rules are like, wait a minute. In 1852, in a full moon, somebody turned a page too quickly, and they really are very hard to figure out. The problem is that Senate rules are not a simple majority vote. And I can't remember now if there is a number associated with it, or if it's 2/3 of the Senate, or if it is some other fraction, but it takes a supermajority of the Senate to change the Senate rules. And that's one of the reasons we still have the filibuster, is it was very difficult to get a supermajority to go ahead and get rid of that. So so it would be hard to take the filibuster back to where it used to be, with this simple exception. And that is that it is possible to use what people are calling the nuclear option. And what this comes down to is, again, a very arcane Senate rule, and that is that the Senate operates according to precedent. So you can go ahead and you can change precedent, but you have to have a simple majority in order to change precedent. And that is possible to do it, but people tend not to want to do it because they don't want to go ahead and have the Senate go back to a simple Senate majority vote for everything.
And is that what Democrats did under Harry Reid? I believe they did that to make it so that you could not have a filibuster on judicial appointments below the level of Supreme Court. And then Mitch McConnell kicked it up a notch and decided to nuke it.
And when people call it the nuclear option, that really bothers me, because I used to hear the nuclear option. I'd be like, oh my God, we're not going to have a Senate any longer. And it's not at all that. It's really, again, these are both arcane Senate rules. And to my mind, and this is just a different arcane Senate rule, where you simply, you have to refer to a point of, to a previous question, I think is what it is. It's a kind of a two-step around it, but it goes ahead and establishes a new Senate precedent. And then once it's there, of course, it's very hard to replace it.
So that would suggest then that the only option Democrats would have to change the filibuster is that nuclear option, which I don't have a better word for that. That's the only thing they could do with a simple majority, correct? They would not be able to go back to the way that it used to be, and it had to be a talking filibuster. Am I understanding that correctly? Because they do not have a supermajority.
No, you could go ahead and adjust the filibuster. You could use the nuclear. So yes. First of all, they can do anything they want, right? They just have to have the political will to do it. But yes, you could go ahead and reform the filibuster in such a way that they did with the judicial appointments and say, we're going to get rid of the filibuster for things having to do with voting, or for things having to do with insurrections, or with things having to do with the planting of flamingos in your yard, if that's what they wanted to do that for. So you could do carve-outs, which is one of the things people have talked about. Or you could say, hey, wait a minute, we got to change these rules and go back to talking filibusters. And that's one of the things that Joe Manchin has put forward as something that he would be comfortable doing, is taking us back to the way things used to be. Because the idea that you don't have to do a talking filibuster is, of course, quite recent. So when people talk about preserving the filibuster, they're really not talking about preserving the filibuster. They're talking about preserving the rule from the 1970s, which is a different kettle of fish altogether.
Okay, so then it would be possible to alter the way the filibuster has been used with a simple majority. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay. And actually, one of the questions that just arrived, and we'll go to the ones that came in earlier, but I think this one's timely. Do you have a better phrase than nuclear option, since that one seems to be problematic? How would you call that?
I would just call it reforming the filibuster, or reestablishing precedent. Again, you hear
Or eliminating it.
Pardon me?
Or eliminating it, right? I mean, when I think of the nuclear option, I think of eliminating it altogether.
Well, that's what it sounds like, doesn't it? But the nuclear option was a term that was adopted by the Republicans in order to suggest that what Harry Reid did was was irresponsible or was extreme, when in fact he did it because he couldn't get any judicial appointments through. And I really always, across political history, object to using the terms of an opponent for something that their opponents are doing. So that was itself a piece of political propaganda. You can call it reforming the filibuster, you can call it referring to the previous question, you can call it adjusting the filibuster, but it's not nuclear. I mean, the world did not blow up when we have gotten rid of the filibuster for these two different categories of bills. Most people don't even know they're not there for those bills, and the world yet remains standing.
That's an excellent point about the fact that it was a political phrase that was used as a marketing tool. One of the other questions that we had submitted by someone in advance, it's long, but it's a really great question. I may be naive, but I never thought of the filibuster as a particularly Republican tool, but available for members of either party to use if they felt strongly enough about an issue to use it. How have we come to associate it with the Republican Party, and why is it a bad thing?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's not, you're absolutely right. It is available to the members of either party, which is one of the reasons actually right now that that Manchin of West Virginia and Sinema of Arizona have not wanted to interrupt it, because they're among other things, there's other things going on, but they're institutionalists, and they really object to changing institutions, which is really quite odd if you think about the fact that that traditionally, in terms of ideology, it's conservatives who don't like to change institutions, which is, by the way, one of the reasons I try not to use words like conservative in any kind of political context nowadays, because the categories are entirely off. So yes, it's available there for anybody to use, but it has become associated in the present with the Republican Party because they're the ones who use it. It was associated in the 19th century and in the, not that they used it really in the 19th century, but in the civil rights era with the Democratic Party. And the reason for that, and the reason that the filibuster is often called Jim Crow 2.0, is because what the filibuster permits is it permits a real minority to go ahead and to stop really quite popular legislation. And they do it arguing that this is the protection of minority rights. But the reality is that it tends to be the protection of a really unpopular position, like, as I say, trying to filibuster civil rights legislation, or filibustering in the present era. As I say, that really dramatically was the passage of the gun control legislation after the Sandy Hook massacre, which, again, there was a huge popular will to pass that, and it was stopped by the filibuster. But it's not just that. There's any number, well, even things like the transportation bill, which is enormously popular right now, or any number of things that simply can't get through the Senate because there's an entrenched minority, not only in the Senate but also in the country that that objects to doing that. And that's why I say this is really a question about democracy. How do you want your democracy to work? And I continue to think you have a problem if you have a great majority of the people who continually see their legislature not able to do the things they want it to do because of this old, newly used old rule. So it's not particular to the Republican Party. It is particular to a particular moment in a democracy where there is a minority that is able to use it in such a way that they can stop a majority from passing legislation.
So interesting. You mentioned earlier that, and I don't recall the exact numbers, but we have 50 Republican senators and 50 either Democrats or independents who caucus with Democrats. And yet the number of Democrats, the number of people represented by those 50 Republican senators significantly smaller than those. So
40.5 million.
40.5 million. So under a
there are 331 million people in America, so it's not a small difference.
Okay, so exactly. So under Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who technically represented his party, they were in the majority, but they represented a minority of Republicans, were able to stop a minority party from pushing through majority preferred legislation. I just find that kind of ironic. And now we're back to a situation where the Republicans are using the filibuster in a way in which you've just described it was intended to be used, for a minority to stop passage of legislation that a majority of people wanted. But under the Republican leadership, when they were in control of the Senate, it was reversed. They used it to stop majority popular language legislation.
Yes, and that so it's not just the filibuster that's a problem right now. There's a number of aspects of our democracy that are problematic right now, and this is, of course, what I write about and what I worry about a lot. And in this particular case, the filibuster is what we're focusing on because it is one of the mechanics that is enabling minorities to stop the passage of legislation. But as you say, one of the other issues is the fact that we have a changing demographic in this country, which means that red states continue to hold a lot of power, even though their numbers are continuing to drop. And that's got a much longer history in the country. So, for example, we look at the Electoral College and worry about the Electoral College, and people say, oh, we got to keep that exactly the way it was. But the Electoral College was never intended to be a winner-take-all system. That comes in under Jefferson. I could tell you that story if you wanted, but the interesting thing about that is once you get the winner-take-all system on a state-by-state basis, you also have that's a problem. But then in 1929, we get the capping of the House of Representatives at the number it's at now, which means that it badly disadvantages larger states because they don't grow at the rate that they would if there was not this capped population. And the reason we got that in 29 was because the census of 1920 had revealed that, in fact, for the first time in American history, there were more people living in cities than there were in rural areas. So there are a number of ways in which we have twisted our democracy in such a way that we have created a crisis that we are right now trying to figure out. And that's on the table for all of us to figure out how to do.
Well, you mentioned you're talking about states, so that actually tees off to another question. Do any state legislatures have a filibuster type rule that you know of?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know state legislatures terribly well.
Well, that was one of the second question involving state legislatures, is that the filibuster is not used in state legislatures and legislation gets passed. Why do we need it at the federal level at all?
Well, frankly, I think we don't need it. I think it is, and I'm a funny person to ask that because for years I'm an institutionalist too. So for years I'm like, we got to keep the filibuster. It's great, but I never really thought about why. And I just liked it because it had just been around forever. And then I actually did a cost benefit thing and a number of years ago, and I thought, wait a minute. we only have it because it kind of just didn't get knocked off the books, and the Senate never came up with a way to make people stop talking. That's no reason to have anything. And so let me tell you why some people now argue that we need it, and that's that they say that it forces the Senate to be bipartisan. That is, I cannot emphasize how wrong that is. And I'm a scholar of Congress, so believe me, I have read literally dozens, decades of congressional debates. And the answer is that if you have to pass things by a simple majority, it's understood that you're going to make changes largely incrementally, and that if you get egg all over your face, you're going to pay for it. So people say, oh, we're going to whiplash back and forth. But that's not all that happened when you actually had things passing by a simple majority. Things did change, and certainly people argued about things, but there was much more a sense of legislation being a daily process, and you would, if you really screwed up, you pay for it at the next election. But there weren't these giant sweeps back and forth that we now have, where you have to have a supermajority to get something, so the legislation becomes extraordinary. The other thing the filibuster has done to us that I am opposed to, many political scientists are not, but I am, and that's that we tend to have these giant omnibus bills that pass as budget reconciliation bills. And those this is when we get these giant $1 trillion bills. That's because you can't ever get the little stuff through any longer. So people throw everything into omnibus bills at the end of the year, and your option as a legislator is simply to take it or not. And I just think that's a terrible way to do business. I think that we really ought to have conversations about the smaller bills and decide whether or not we like them, rather than having everything pass as an omnibus bill, which is what we're stuck with now, because everything has to wait to be passed as a budget reconciliation bill.
And about the budget reconciliation, you mentioned that there are, I think you said it could be used 3 times in the session. Yeah. Is that correct? Okay. And so far,
something funny happened under the Senate parliamentarian this year. And she basically said it was possible to reopen an already passed bill, which I thought was really interesting. We have not done it yet. And it seems to me to be something that at the very least will have to be worked out. But the parliamentarian people sometimes get mad at the parliamentarian, but I say it's kind of, she's good. She's operated under both Obama, not just both, Obama, Trump, and Biden. And basically, I always think of the Senate parliamentarian like your certified public accountant. Like, you may not like what the CPA says, but the CPA knows the law. And so if she says she thinks it's okay, she's certainly more likely to know than I am.
The American Rescue Plan was passed under reconciliation, correct? And so was the 2017 tax bill, I believe, the GOP
Yes.
tax bill, that was under reconciliation. And Republicans attempted to repeal Obamacare using reconciliation and lost that particular battle. Okay.
That's correct. And in the last 2 that you mentioned, in the tax cuts of 2017, known as the Trump tax cuts, not a single Democrat voted for those. And right. The American Rescue Plan, not a single Republican voted for those, for the American Rescue Plan. Although, interestingly enough, a number of them are now taking credit for what was in it, telling their constituents. And it's interesting because a recent poll suggested that a number of people who have benefited from that are not aware that, in fact, it was a Democratic bill, that they think it was a Republican bill.
Right. I see that on Twitter, in the Twitterverse. Could a group of U.S. representatives, for example, House representatives, could they sue under constitutional law to get rid of the filibuster?
I am not a constitutional lawyer. Like I say, I really do try when I talk about this stuff to stay in my lane. Yeah. Because I could guess, but that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks.
Well, not much of a cup of coffee at Starbucks these days.
Exactly. I always pick on Starbucks.
There's a question about this idea of packing the courts. How can the filibuster or other similar cloture rules, like the nuclear option, and I know we're not going to be using that anymore, but be used to help a simple Democratic Senate majority to pack the court? How does the Constitution or other precedents influence the rules on passing legislation versus approving nominations?
Okay, so the idea of passing legislation is exactly the same, and the idea of nominations is not covered by the filibuster any longer for those categories I talked about. So so those two differences stay the same. Now there's something important in the language that's in that question, and that is the idea of packing the courts is associated with Franklin Delano Roosevelt after he wins re-election in 36, when he goes ahead and gets mad that he's losing so many of his cases in the Supreme Court. And he talks about, he goes to the people and he says, well, you know, you got to make the Supreme Court bigger because the justices are all too old, which is obviously not what he meant. He basically meant, you know, we got to go ahead and put more people on the court so that they do what I want them to do. And that became known as court packing. And the idea is that you make the court bigger in order to make it do what you want it to do. And it's got a really bad rap in this country because of FDR doing that. However, there is not settled in the Constitution how many people are supposed to be on the Supreme Court. So it's had a number of different people on it in our history. The last time we changed the number of Supreme Court justices was in, anybody know?
Not me.
1869. So we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court because there were 9 circuits at the time, and now we have 12. I always have a problem because there's a 3 in there twice, so I always think it's 13. No, it's 12 circuits. So there's an argument to be made that we need the extra justices because there's simply more work, and there are so many more people and so many more cases in America right now. But then there's another issue that is, like I say, there's a lot of issues about democracy right now that are on the table because we've kicked the can down the road for as long as we have. And that's that the Supreme Court as it currently exists is already stacked, which is a distinction that I'm going to make from packed. Packed says let's put more people on it until we get a group we like. Stacked says we have manipulated the way that people went on the court in such a way that it does not accurately represent American society. So what has happened is traditionally the court was supposed to be not nonpartisan at all, but it was not supposed to be way out there. The times that it has gotten way out there were in the 1850s under Roger Taney, the Taney court that hands down the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, which, by the way, I was looking today, and today is the anniversary on which Dred Scott was emancipated by his enslaver, which is neither here nor there, but it's kind of a cool piece of trivia. It happened under Taney. It happened in the 1890s and the 1900s under Justice Melville Fuller, which I'm afraid we have to claim him in the state of Maine. He was a Mainer. And he handed down decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, like Policy Farmers Loan, which says that the Supreme Court that the United States government is not strong enough to have an income tax, which is how we get the amendment to the Constitution saying, oh, for God's sake, of course we're strong enough to have an income tax. Taft is actually a big pusher of that. And then, of course, we have it being way out there nowadays. And in each of those cases, which one of the things that I find interesting, the Taney court and the Fuller court, basically almost everything they did has been overturned in our history, with the exception in the Fuller court of the insular cases, which is what's given us unincorporated territories like Samoa, like at the time it was the Philippines, but they of course became their own country in 43. Puerto Rico, Guam, the unincorporated territories, and the concept of non-citizen nationals, the idea that people are coming to the purview of the American government, but they don't have the right to vote here. Those are holdovers from the Fuller court called the insular cases in the early 1900s. But now we once again have a court that is not representative of America. And the reason that we are here and the way this happened was this. If you remember, by the way, is this interesting?
Yes.
Because I don't have to go into this.
No.
Because I just like this stuff. But if it's like, you guys are like, it's 7:20, we're done.
Well, one question that we've had asked like 4 or 5 times by 4 or 5 different people, and I think this really cuts to the chase. Why not eliminate the filibuster? What do you foresee happening if we eliminate it? What are I think we can kind of guess the reasons to eliminate it so that we can, under current structure, pass legislation. But why should we keep it?
I can tell you why we are keeping it. Why should we keep it? I got nothing.
Okay, why
We
are we
are
keeping it?
we are keeping it currently, and this actually goes to, I can explain the courts later if you would like, but this goes to where I said to you there's something really interesting going on in Congress right now. And that is that right now, the Democrats, 48 Democrats appear, hasn't been voting yet, but they appear to be on board for getting rid of the filibuster, at least in limited ways, primarily over Senate number 1, which is also House of Representatives number 1, which is known as For the People Act, which is a long act that cleans up our democracy. So it makes it easier to vote, protects the right to vote. It gets rid of partisan gerrymandering, which is another really huge problem that I could explain if you want. And it addresses the problems of Citizens United by getting big money out of politics. And it does a number of other things. Now, that bill itself needs work. It's a long bill. There are things in which it does need some amendments, but the general concept of protecting our democracy and our ability to vote is actually a really good one. And most Democrats are on board for this simple reason. Because right now, in May of 2021, with the voter suppression that's going on in a number of Republican-dominated states, Iowa, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and there's a number of other states on board as well that are being pushed by Heritage Action, which is an activist branch of Heritage, to go ahead and eliminate the ability for populations that are expected to vote Democrat to actually make it to the polls. If you look at that, and if you look at the extreme partisan gerrymandering in states that were captured by the Republicans in 2010, which there was a Republican operation called Operation Red Map, which was designed to go ahead and take state legislatures like Georgia, like North Carolina, like Wisconsin, like Kansas and Ohio, a whole bunch of these states, and then to partisan gerrymander in such a way that it's virtually impossible for Democrats ever to win a majority again in those legislatures. If you look at those two things, it means that it is virtually impossible for Democrats ever to win an election again. And to win the White House, for example, if you look at the changes that are taking place right now, today in Arizona, but also in Georgia, for example, in Florida, where it's going to be harder and harder for Democrats actually to be able to carry those states and to be able to certify Democrats for the presidency going forward after 2024 or in 2024. So Democrats look at that and they're like, we got to pass this law or we'll never win again. And the Republicans look at that and they say, if you pass this law, we will never win again. Because really, since at least the 1990s, they have relied on gerrymandering and on voter suppression to go ahead and to be able to return Republican majorities. So, or to stay in power. It's not even Republican majorities, it's in order to stay in power. So Democrats are looking at that and saying, we got to get rid of it. And Republicans are looking at it and saying, we got to keep it. And then you have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. And they are looking at it as institutionalists, among other things. And Sinema's a real cipher. But Manchin is from West Virginia, which is a state that in 2016, as I recall, went 42 points for Donald Trump. He's a Democrat in what is now a bright red state. He's one of the few who has not flipped over. And he simply is trying to keep his constituents happy. So without him, it ain't going to happen. But there's something really interesting going on right now in Congress, because the Democrats in Congress have not wanted to have the filibuster fight over Senate 1, for example, because it is such a, you can see every time it comes up, all the leading Republicans are out there saying the Democrats are trying to steal the vote. And they haven't wanted to have it over the Transportation Act because, which is known as the American Jobs Act, but it's an infrastructure project, because they don't really necessarily need to. They're going to be able to break that up in a number of ways that Republicans will probably get on board with, because Republicans like a lot of infrastructure as well. Not as much as the Democrats do, but they want their roads fixed. But the issue over which they might be able to break the filibuster is the attempt to pass this House of Representatives bill that establishes a bipartisan independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection.
Now
And
that's interesting.
yes, and you can see, but you can see this, if you can see this in a number of places, that this is where the fight is going on, because in the last 24 hours, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who's got an independent base, so she's fascinating to watch. She's got her own independent power base, so she can do what her constituents want and what she thinks is right. She's always an interesting character to watch. Mitt Romney, who also has an independent power base. The Mormons in Utah, who are Republicans, don't like the Trump wing of the party, so the Mormons are there an independent base. They both came out and said that they would support the idea of this independent commission. And now you had yesterday Sinema and Manchin delivering a statement begging their Republican colleagues to get on board with this independent commission. And what seems to be happening is that this is the issue over which there is going to be an attempt to break the filibuster, or to get enough Republicans on board that they will get that investigation without having to break the filibuster. But it looks like it's going to come, to me, who knows, but it looks like breaking the filibuster is going to come down to this January 6th commission bill. And the bill is, interestingly enough, as you know, it's precisely what Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Minority Leader, asked for. He got everything he asked for, expecting that the Democrats would not give it to him, and they called his bluff. They gave it to him, and then he was like, "Oh well, it's not really what I wanted." And you can see, if you're watching this, you can see the Republicans saying, "Well, they're trying to drag things on into next year." In fact, the bill guarantees
has a hard stop at the end of the year.
Has a hard stop at the end of the year. Yeah.
Right.
So we'll see. That's where it's
interestingly enough, and I know that you had other things going on you may not have heard, but Susan Collins announced today that she will vote for the commission to allow in the first round of voting, to allow it to proceed, because she wants to be able to add her amendment. Now, that doesn't mean that she will vote for it on the final vote, but she did come out today and say that she will vote for it to allow it to proceed.
Yeah, there's been so much bait and switch on that side of the aisle.
Yeah, I don't know where we are on I'm not doing a whip count, so I have no idea where we are on that. We have a few more questions, but I do have one request for you to go back to the courts that you were talking about. And I think maybe that would be important, because a lot of the things that we're talking about doing, a lot of the laws that people would like to see passed, that the Republicans are trying to stop, like the Equality Act, for example, and other ones, the Supreme Court is getting ready to hear cases, decide cases, hand down their verdicts, their rulings. And I think people are really wanting to see some law move forward to trump, pardon the term, some of the rulings they're expecting to come out of this very slanted court. So if you wanted to go back, you mentioned, you stopped and you said the Supreme Court now does not mirror the American public.
It does not.
Right. And tell me what you mean by that. And I also want to point out too, we're at 7:27. You've been on the computer all day long. You've been grading papers for weeks and weeks and weeks. You have a blog still to write for tonight that we're all anxiously awaiting. But I think here people on this call would be willing to give you a buy on doing it today, if you can stay with us just a few minutes longer.
Yeah, let me explain the court stuff, because I love this. I don't know about you all, but like, do you remember the fight over Robert Bork? And you're like, what is this even about? Why are people so angry? At least I was that way, and I didn't really understand this at the time. Let me give you the nutshell of why our courts are in such a mess. And it's this. If you go back to FDR in the New Deal managed to go ahead and provide what was essentially economic equality to people in America, but he was basically looking at white men. Because every time he even tried to look for leveling the playing field for people of color, white Democrats, because he was a Democrat, basically said, "Don't even go there, dude." I paraphrase. So when Eisenhower takes over, and I just skipped Truman, I know, and I can talk about Truman if you want, but when Eisenhower takes over, he feels very strongly that America has to deal with civil rights. And he feels that way not only because he was the commander of the Allied Forces, and but also because he recognizes that communist nations are using America's I can't think of the word. It's not apartheid. You know what I mean, racial segregation. There we go. We're using America's segregation to say democracy ain't all it's cracked up to be. Like, this is ridiculous. You need to switch to communism. And he recognizes that it's a really powerful propaganda tool for communist nations. So one of the first things that Eisenhower does is when it comes time, when he has an opening on the Supreme Court, he puts Earl Warren on the Supreme Court. And Earl Warren is a former Republican governor of California. And one of the first, that happens in January of 1954. And in May of 1954, the Warren Court hands down two decisions. And the second one, the first one is similar, but they hand down the second one, which is Brown versus Board of Education. And what the Brown v. Board decision does, and it's not the first one that does it, it's just the one that everybody's heard of. The person who really comes up, one of the people who comes up with what I'm going to explain that decision does, is Thurgood Marshall, which is why Thurgood Marshall is thought to be such a great jurist. What it does is it essentially looks at the Constitution, and it reaches through the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, through the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment, and it reaches through them back to the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was written to apply only to the federal government, but it pulls those 10 amendments forward and it applies them to the states. And once you have done that, you can't prohibit interracial marriage. You can't prohibit segregation. You can't have segregation in schools. All of those things are because this new judicial doctrine, which promptly conservatives, especially people who are interested in preserving segregation, call judicial activism. That's the idea of judicial activism. And then after Warren steps down, and by the way, people used to step down off the court. They didn't have to be carried off. It was really quite common to come and go on the Supreme Court, and you were expected to spend a number of years, but not, hold on till grim death on there, which itself is one of the weird aspects of where we are in society right now. I could explain, but I don't have time. But then Warren Burger takes over. He's a Nixon appointee. He's also a Republican, and he extends that to the rights of women to reproductive health care, which is how we get Roe versus Wade. People forget that that's under a Republican Chief Justice, and the decision is written by a Republican because they are trying to push the idea of civil rights and this use of the 14th Amendment to apply the 10 amendments in the beginning of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, to the states. All right. So then what happens is that this is in the 1960s and the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Then when you get Ronald Reagan in the White House, and he's trying to unravel all of this. He's trying to get rid of the New Deal government and the civil rights legislation of this activist government because it costs taxes and they don't like regulation. Republicans don't like regulation under the Reagan Revolution. Once that happens, it's pretty clear by 1986 that the Republican project is actually not that popular at all. And you're going to get a lot of changes in 86 to try and include, for example, evangelicals in the voting bloc because they're desperate to find new voters to support the Reagan tax cuts of 1986. Once that happens, Edwin Meese, who is Reagan's attorney general, starts deliberately to use the courts to try and overturn what they call judicial activism. They want to get rid of business regulation. They want to get rid of civil rights. And he starts to interview people going into the judiciary to make sure that they will vote in a certain way. And they quite deliberately say they're going to use the courts to preserve the Reagan Revolution so that it can never be overturned, no matter what the popular vote goes on to do going forward. So that attempt to really pack the courts, and not pack the courts in the FDR sense, but stack the courts is, really quite obvious until you get to you look at the nominees that are on the Supreme Court. Most of the people on the Supreme Court nowadays are put there by people who did not win the popular vote. And they are, and of course, by the time you get to Barack Obama, you literally have at the time Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refusing to let him appoint a Supreme Court justice. That's absolutely unprecedented on the grounds that it was too close to an election. Well, Obama made that nomination in March. I believe it was March 19th. The election was going to be in November. In fact, people had always gone ahead and if you had an opening in your term, you went ahead and filled that opening in your term. You didn't always during the lame duck period if you lost, but you went ahead and did it anyway. And then of course we got the here we go, full circle. We got the end of the Supreme Court filibuster to go ahead and enable the Republicans to put on the Supreme Court Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, with the idea that they are people who will, as they say, are originalists. This is the concept of originalism, that you're going to get rid of what they consider judicial activism, get rid of the use of the 14th Amendment to go ahead and apply those rules of the Bill of Rights to the states, and take us to the period before that. Originalism has had four stages, by the way. Take us back to the period before that, because that will get us away from civil rights legislation, away from business regulation, away from all those things that the court did in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. So when we talk about the Supreme Court and people talk about preserving a Supreme Court, what they're talking about is they're preserving a Supreme Court that is devoted now to a judicial belief system that takes us back to a government that is actually in America not at all popular today. And as I said about Bork became a lightning rod because he was the first person out there to say we need to go back to this government that is before we made all these changes. He was also the guy who carried out the Saturday Night Massacre under Nixon. Obviously, nobody else was willing to do it. He was the third person in line in the Department of Justice, so he went ahead and did it. So he had political clout as well. So that's where we are with the courts, and why when people talk about, you don't want to change the courts. Well, the Republicans really have stacked the courts in such a way that they are representing a judicial ideology that is deeply out of step with where America is nowadays. It's another one of those pieces of our democracy that we're going to have to figure out how to fix as we go forward.
Well, what I'm hearing, and I hope Jan John is hearing it too, is a possible additional community conversations where we might have you back to talk about the courts, because I think we had to have a couple of questions dropped into the chat here, but I want to save those in the hopes that you'll come back and talk about the courts, because I do think that's something we're going to see during Biden's administration, whether or not he would agree to expand the court or just institute term limits. I don't know, but I definitely think there's going to be more discussion of that. This has been wonderful, Heather. I don't even know how to thank you enough. Every time I read, I have to say, and I think I speak for a lot of people here, I literally read your blog before I get out of the bed in the morning, and I look at the timestamp of when you sent it, and I just wonder, does this woman ever sleep? Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and for answering all these great questions. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We're going to have a lot of other interesting discussions planned with our community conversation series, and I want to invite everyone to follow that. You can sign up for our email list on our webpage. And I believe that we're about to see a screen share here that will have, there we go, that will have those links on there for you. It's just LincolnCountyDemocrats.com. Please do, if you don't already, follow Heather's blog. Please do. It's Letters from an American. It is linked on our webpage, on the page that talks about this talk that we had tonight. I think that's it. And I just want to thank everybody for coming. We had a huge turnout on our YouTube video and a big turnout here on Zoom with our membership, and we are so grateful. Thank you to everyone, and have a good evening.